Granger causality. Um, Recording in progress. Okay, so the paper that I chose is called Neural Granger Causality, and it's from a couple of years ago, and I kind of backtracked to it from a couple of other papers. So that's how I landed on it, and it just has like this, really appropriate and interesting sounding title. And as usual, once I kind of started getting into it, I, got busy with some other things and didn't have as much time as I wanted to kind of dig in to a few of the details and kind of go back up to the more recent work on it. So this is going to be a little bit more kind of intuition based rather than getting into all of the technical aspects of this paper, but hopefully it should spur some conversation and then I'll also present a little bit of my tangentially related recent research that I kind of was hoping to integrate more directly into this topic, into these methods that they provide, and I just kind of didn't get a chance to get all the way there. So anyway, feel free to chime in at any point if you have comments or questions, or you are more qualified than me to talk about this topic. Um, there we go. So Granger causality, the paper poses it as a framework for time series structure discovery. So basically the goal is to quantify the extent to which the past of one time series variable, so we're assuming that we have time series data here. So the past of one time series aids in the prediction or aids in predicting the future of another time series. So that's what I'm showing by this X and Y variable here with this arrow. It's appropriate for understanding high dimensional and complex data relative to what you might do as a first stab when you have a lot of variables and you're wondering about their interactions, which might be like a lagged correlation analysis. Because the lagged correlation analysis is strictly pairwise, it's just looking at the pairwise lagged correlation between different variables, and that may or may not tell you something about causality. And so just from other sources, Granger causality tests if the past values of X contain information that improves the prediction of future values of Y beyond the information that's already available from Y's own history. Or it quantifies the information that a lagged X provides about Y, conditioned on the knowledge of the history of Y. And if that sounds familiar, it might be because you've heard of transfer entropy before. So that's kind of the definition of transfer entropy. So I won't really go into this part much, but Granger causality is kind of a statistical notion of causality, and it's different from the more interventional notion of causality, which is, we're actually running a trial and we're tweaking some variable and seeing what impact it has on the rest of the system. So we're coming at this from strictly the perspective of we have time series data and we're looking at methods that we can infer causality from that time series data. So with that, there are model-based and model-free methods to do this with, and model-based methods involve a model, surprise. So for example, what you might do traditionally is do linear regression, and the magnitudes of the linear coefficients are the way that you would quantify Granger causality. And coefficients that are close to zero or forced to zero would be non-causal. And then you're kind of doing these regressions and including more and more variables in them or different lag times and with and without the history of the target variable itself, that sort of things. So these are commonly used, but these linear model methods can fail when basically the model is not complex or robust enough to capture the types of relationships that actually exist. So for example, a more nonlinear type of relationship wouldn't be caught correctly by this method. And then on the other side, there's model-free methods, and they don't involve a model. And that's kind of their strength. So measures like transfer entropy or directed information, they're based on taking the data and getting a probability distribution from that data and computing conditional mutual information. And they have minimal assumptions about what the predictive relationship is. So they kind of loosen the assumption that your relationship is linear. However, I think it's come up in this group before. It needs lots and lots of data to reliably estimate these methods, especially as you get higher and higher in dimensionality. And it only gets worse in a really high dimensional setting. Say if you're, trying to condition on like 8 different things or something like that, your data needs and your computational complexity really start exploding. So this particular paper poses deep learning and specifically neural networks as basically just way better models with which to infer Granger causality. So it's a model-based method, and we're just changing the type of model and basically how we can use the weights of these models to make inferences about causality. Okay, so starting with just kind of like the linear concept of what this looks like. Um, this is a model, and basically we're predicting the current value of x based on lags. So k indicates different time lags of itself in the past, and this A is a matrix that I think this is basically like p by p is just all the variables involved in x. So say you have like five, 5 by 5 variables, all of which could be interacting with each other. So A is specifying how at a particular lag, how that variable affects the future evolution of the time series. Um, and basically, a variable is non-causal if its coefficient is 0 for all the lags. So if A is 0 for a certain point to point or X to Y or I to J connection, then we say that it's non-causal. So basically this is solved by a lasso regression problem. So this is basically, we're trying to minimize the error. So this is the error. But we're also adding a penalty term, and this penalty term is penalizing the weights in all these matrices for all these different lags and all these different connections to encourage weights to equal 0. So that's basically you not only are doing this regression problem, but you're kind of like you're wanting to be able to isolate the truly causal variables from the coefficients that are basically 0 by like making them actually equal to 0. Okay, so moving on to like the nonlinear version, a nonlinear version of this is just allowing your dynamics to evolve to a more generic nonlinear dynamical equation, um, but similarly just kind of on the past values of x. And this G, they're suggesting is a neural network, and the two types of they basically suggest two types or two ways of doing this. One is with a multi-layer perceptron with lagged inputs, and a long short-term memory model or an LSTM. And the challenges with just doing this, like just using an MLP or an LSTM, is that they pose number one, these models are difficult to interpret. Their hidden layers are sharing between each other. There's, I guess the way that I read this is that there's a lot of different pathways through which one variable can influence an output. So it's kind of difficult to specify like the meaning of a single weight because there's a lot of pathways and multiple weights that could be kind of like leading to a causal interaction within the model. And secondly, this is a little bit complicated. I think we'll get here later, but a joint network where you have one of these models trying to output multiple outputs. So you're trying to like, you take 6 things and you're trying to predict 6 other things. Each time series depends on the same past lags of the other time series. Um, because your network is the same. Your inputs and you have your inputs and all your weights, and then you get these like final like hidden states And then it's the output weights that are really determining like, okay, I'm going to allocate, these different states to the actual like six predictions. So in some ways, it's like all of your output variables are responding to the same time lags and the same inputs. And they're kind of saying that realistically, each output might depend on different past lags of each input. So that's another kind of challenge with using these models. So they pose a structured neural network approach, and basically each output component is going to get its own model. So they're solving that kind of discrepancy that like some variables may be responding to the inputs at different lag times than others, and we want to know what those differences are. So you want to know, one thing is responding to another thing at a lag of 12, and another thing is responsive at a different lag. So they're calling these component-wise models, and all that means is that we have multiple inputs. So the whole system is kind of an input, and then we're only trying to predict the future of one at a time. And then in addition to that, these machine learning models have sparsity-inducing penalties on their weights. And basically, this is just a definition from the paper that they're saying that, a time series is non-causal if it's invariant, if the prediction is invariant to it. And okay, so I'll start with the multi-layer perceptron from kind of like a intuitive approach. This is just a generic image of a multi-layer perceptron. Um, and here we're going to consider input features that include lagged versions of each input feature. So you have potentially a lot of inputs if you have multiple variables and you have multiple lags of each of those variables. Each of those is going to be a separate input. We're going to have one or more of these hidden layers. And our output, this illustration is showing two, but there's actually just one output. So there's a whole bunch of inputs, a bunch of hidden layers, and a single output. And we're really going to focus on penalizing these weights on the input layer. So we're not really going to worry. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in here. And what they're going to focus on penalizing is these input weights. And basically the goal is to bias the network to represent non-causal relationships with zero weights on the input. Because if there's an input of a certain variable at a certain lag and all these things become zero, it is not allowed to influence any of the rest of the dynamics of the network. So the focus is on the input weights. And there's a lot of different ways to penalize these weights, it turns out. And so this is their illustration of like 3 different ways that you could do this. And I hate that in this illustration they used 4 for everything. It's like every dimension is 4. So it's like a little bit hard to decide like what a row and a column meant. But I think we figured it out. Basically, this K, these are lag times. So this is an example where we have like 4 lag times. And each of these boxes is an input feature. So this is a model where we have 4 input features. Each input feature is being considered at 4 different lag times. And then these rows are the hidden layer units. So we have 4 hidden units here. And basically, in this group method, this would be a penalty that acts equally across all lags for a given input. So just in this illustration, we find that the second input is like all of those weights get zeroed out, and we say that lag, or not lag, the second input is non-causal, and all the other 3 inputs are causal to a given whatever we're trying to predict. Then the mixed is a little bit more specific because it considers sparsity across the input groups, where similarly here, we find that 2 is not causal in any way, and all the weights are 0 from all the lags and then all the hidden units. But here we're looking also within groups across the lag times. So we're more specifically saying here, input number 1 is causal at a lag time of 2. And input number 3 is causal at these 2 lag times. And finally, the one that they actually deploy is this, they call it the hierarchical technique, where they basically do this group thing where they eliminate, entire input variables, and then they're also looking at lags that are less than the certain threshold. So in this example, you'd say that input number 1 is causal at lag times of 2 or less, and input number 3 is causal at lag times of 3 or less. So you kind of have like a maximum lag time at which a certain variable is causal. And again, these sparsity penalties are only applied on the input weights. Okay, so that was one. That's just the first method that they pose. The second one is long short-term memory models. So these are also neural networks, but instead of each input being a separate variable at a separate lag, here the inputs are sequential. And basically, an LSTM consists of a system of gates, which are activation functions that control a longer term self state and a shorter term hidden state, and basically selectively retains information from either longer term memory or shorter term memory based on sequential inputs. So this is kind of like the typical image of an LSTM unit. And just to illustrate the sequentialness of this, say we had an example like previously where we're interested in 4 time lags. This is kind of what your LSTM unit would look like, where at each time lag you're inputting the next input and basically crunching numbers in the same way with the same weights with the same thing. Um, and this is only one unit, so there's multiple units. And a thing to note here is that the weights are different across the units. So if you imagine a bunch of these things going kind of like in parallel, you have different weights on each unit, but they're the same for each time step in the sequence. So when it comes to like defining like a certain weight on a certain time lag, that's not really a thing. But basically, we'll get to that in a second. But something to keep in mind. Okay, so the weights for LSTMs will look a little bit different. So the way that they kind of define the sparsity is a little bit different. So here, oh good. Okay, so each gate, forget the input, the output, and the cell candidate state have different weights. And this is an example where we have 4 input features. So now the rows are input features, and these columns are hidden units. So we have 4 hidden states. And the way that the sparsity works here is that if an input is deemed non-causal, it should have 0 weights across all of these guys. Um, yeah, so we've kind of lost like the time lag element because that's more embedded into the LSTM itself. And basically the non-causalness comes from just all of the input weights for all of the gates being 0 for a certain input feature. So it's not it's not influencing the model prediction. Um, yeah. Okay, so those are the methods just without some of the math that's included in the paper, but hopefully that gives you kind of a vibe. Um, and they do some comparisons with basically some other causality methods that are model-based causality methods in a couple of different data types where they have like a known causal map. So the first thing they do is they test it on linear models with sparse transition matrices. So just generating data with a certain data length. So these are different, like generating between 250 and 1,000 data points. So these are not huge data sets that they're generating. And then they're using their two methods and comparing with two other methods. And basically this number that they're comparing is the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, and we can interpret that as a measure of overall performance in terms of they know the true causal map and they have a causal map that they get from these sparsity penalty weights. And they are looking at like true positives versus false positives in that matrix. And they're looking at different threshold values on the sparsity penalty. So I haven't showed that in a while, but going like um, way back to here, like this lambda, basically changing this lambda indicates how strongly you're gonna like penalize this matrix. So changing that lambda value has an influence on, what gets zeroed out and what gets kept. Sorry about that. Gonna go. Okay.
Allison,
Yep.
just a point of clarification. Along the way, they were mentioning lasso, but your equation is an L2 norm. Are they actually using an L1 norm?
Um, that's a good question. They do say the L2 norm. They talk about the L2 norm. But I think maybe the lasso part comes in. Well,
Usually to
I don't know.
zero
I'd
out
have to go
weights, you use lasso, not L2. Yeah.
back. Yeah, I do not know. I'd have to go back and read the details. It's been
Thanks.
a week or two before since I like really looked at this. Um, yeah. Um, so Yeah, so basically they find, their method has good overall performance across like a range of, different threshold values at which you can make these input weights sparse. And the comparisons that they use are existing LSTM models that are kind of set up to infer causality in a similar way. And they're based on previous papers, which I didn't get a chance to really go back to. But basically, this one has this IMV attention. LSTM has an attention mechanism, and its goal is to highlight model dependence on different parts of the inputs. So basically, they're looking at like an attention weight matrix to look at to infer causal relationships. And then this is a leave one out LSTM. And it's just a more typical LSTM that tests including or withholding different inputs to determine the most influential ones. So it's to me, it seems like they're basically just running LSTMs with and without combinations of different sources and looking at how influential that is. And somehow they're coming up with like a similar metric with which to compare the efficiency of these methods. So they find, really, impressive performance across a really large range of data sizes on this linear model. Um, and yeah, so this is just, I just pasted this on, I thought it was kind of an interesting thing to look into further. Basically, they say, the IMV is underperforming these component-wise methods that they suggest, likely because it's not explicitly designed for Granger causality. And they mention like previous work that suggests that attention mechanisms are not indicative of feature importance. Um, and and then the problem with the leave one out approach was basically that right, they might be overfitting when they have not enough data. And basically, yeah, like if you withhold a single time series, it won't impact the loss if the remaining time series have dependencies that retain its signal. So kind of related to like the interdependencies, potential interdependencies between input variables, I guess. Um, and they do some explorations on like how sensitive the thresholds are to the findings. And so the lambda is this threshold value, and basically this is I kind of forget like what I forget like what this model actually is. Like this is like the true causality graph, and then there oh it's like one of the autoregressive models, I think. And basically looking at different lambda values and how close they kind of replicate this true graph. And basically if the lambda is too small, you kind of have like false detections. And then if it's too large, you kind of like lose like longer time lag interactions, which kind of makes sense. And so anyway, lambda is a thing that you have to choose, and it's not like entirely oh, they do say the magnitude of each entry is the L2 norm of the associated input weights of the neural network after training. Um, so anyway, it's just, there's some up in the air discussion about how you might best choose a lambda for your given purpose. And then they also test on this Dream 3 data, which I don't fully understand, but it's a difficult and nonlinear data set with small samples of gene expression data. So there's a known causal map, and then they have like short sequences of time series data. Um, and then they compare some other methods that I don't remember what they are, but they find that basically the component-wise neural networks do a good job, and have higher scores than these other methods.
Sorry,
And
the lasso there, that's the bar with the lasso, right?
the bar with this label.
Yeah,
I'm not
that
sure. Yeah, I'm not
okay.
sure like what exactly that model is
Okay.
like.
That's my
These
guess.
are three other methods, but yes, it's been a minute. That is a good guess.
Oh, wait, no, it says results for our proposed regularized multi-layer and LSTM models with a different set of methods. So there's no bar there. Okay. I think I understand. Thank you.
Sure. Um, and something about motion capture. I'm not going to talk about this at all, but it was kind of I think this is like, their research area, and it's like data time series data generated from like motion capture devices on different like body parts. Um, which makes me think of some, like animated feature or something where, they do this type of thing. But they're kind of like, that here they're just illustrating that like different states are associated with like different motions and like body positions. And they kind of do a study on like the connectivity of these like body positions. Um, And then at the end, they kind of they propose a combined approach that basically involves both the recurrent neural network and the multi-layer perceptron. And the idea, I think the idea is to overcome the aspect that right now what they're doing is just having like a totally separate model for each output. So each output has kind of like its own LSTM, and then you have like a set of weights that determines causality. And here it's a little bit more connected, because what you would do is basically create individual recurrent neural networks and get the hidden states. And so then the multi-layer perceptrons are basically getting these different hidden states, and then each one is predicting one of the outputs. And I think in this illustration, like these are the weights that you would be um, penalizing. And let me see, joint learning, the whole network with a group penalty of the input weights of the individual MLPs will allow the network to share information about hidden features while also allowing interpretable structure learning between the hidden states. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what they end with was just like a proposed method that kind of combines combines this like individual modeling approach and kind of enables like joint prediction of the outputs. All right, any questions or comments on that before I move on a little bit? All right, so the next thing that I will switch over to the GitHub repo briefly. I like just, ran a couple of the demo codes and it's kind of nice. Like, it's you're able to kind of like play with these methods and I think dig deeper into what's really going on. But I didn't get a lot of a chance to really do that. So I'll just show it. But the other thing that I wanted
Yes.
to do is, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, before you go ahead. Um, so I was looking it up. So Granger causality is not really causality, it's correlation, right? Um, Even though they call it, they're basically saying there's predictive power in past values.
Right.
Um, can you give me an intuition for, give me an example or intuition for why you might want to know um, which past values are predictive and which are not in a time series? Yeah.
Which like the lag time question of like what
I mean, in a sense, what we're doing is not terribly different from a unit hydrograph or an autoregressive model or even a transformer where you're saying, um, I know that past values are helpful for telling me what the next value is, but the implication here seems to be that instead of paying attention to everything with some window into the past, we want to zero out some of those attention weights. And so I'm trying to understand the physical rationalization underlying why that's considered to be interesting and useful. Yeah.
Right, like why do you need to zero out weights if you can get just as good of a prediction not doing that, or even a better prediction probably not doing that? Yes, I think I mean, I think it kind of goes back to interpretability of the models because it does I guess it's within us to want to know like what are the most important predictors and what are the ones that are like important and like how are predictors correlated with each other and how does that influence like if you knew the past of one thing, is that better than knowing the
Okay.
more recent past of another thing?
So it's pretty much just trying to drive sparsity into the model so that
Yeah.
it makes it easier to explain or to analyze.
Yeah, and I guess in the case of like the linear, they generate data given a certain connection, given like a certain adjacency matrix, and they are like saying like, oh, here we can reproduce this adjacency matrix, right, with just by looking at like the model weights, which if you had just run the LSTM or just run the MLP, you would have had all not like your weights would have all been non-zero and you would have had to make some sort of decision of, how were you able to tell what was important or not. Which I mean, you're kind of in this case, you're still making kind of a subjective decision on what the sparsity penalty is in the first place. So
That's
you're
fine. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah. Thanks for the
Okay.
question.
Yeah, I mean, if you can impose a sparsity penalty without affecting performance significantly, then why not? I mean, that sort of makes sense
Yeah.
because you're looking
Yeah.
for parsimony. But I
Yeah.
was
And they,
wondering
they
if
didn't
there
really
was,
they didn't really go into that of like the how well their models were predicting relative to a standard version of the same models. They didn't really go into that, but that's a good question.
yeah, no, I thought there might be some uh, useful example where you could say, well, I need to know that it's three time steps, three lags previous that was the most important time step. And I was trying to get an intuition with some kind of physical example. I think Louise has something to say. Yeah.
Yeah, if I have the chance to guess, is
I
that
was
it's
thinking
something that
of your hydro-LSTM, by the way.
yeah, it's something like that. Yeah. I was thinking that what's happened with LSTN is that at the end, all the variables are having the same lag. In some way, the sequence length is basically you're imposing that for all the inputs. But for a simple, for example, you can have some processes that are having different lag in some way. So that means that the sequence length should be different for different input in some way.
Fair enough.
If you have a process that is related with temperature, maybe for that you need 3 days, and you need another one related with precipitation, and you need 3 months. So in some way, that tension should be different. And this is something that now is kind of fixed with LSTM.
Okay, fair enough. In fact, I think you pointed out you were looking at the slag issue in your hydro-LSTM. So you're saying you could have variable sequence lengths, and that would be a useful thing to know. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so bonus topic. This is the tangentially related topic that I mentioned, that I was kind of like, oh, I have this data set and maybe I'll, like play around with it with the methods from this paper, and I definitely did not get the chance to do that. But basically what I've kind of been digging into a little bit is predictions of stream chemistry, solute concentration variables, using long short-term memory models. So for a little bit of context, basically what we have in our critical zone project is about a year and a half of 30-minute stream solute concentrations. So these 7 different dissolved solutes, in addition to flow rate. Basically, it's a USGS gauge. And this is a pretty unprecedented data set, because we're almost never measuring this ensemble of solutes at such a high concentration. So we actually have like a laboratory that's set up next to the river, and it's doing all the chromatography and like all the filtering and everything that you would normally be doing in a lab, kind of like on a weekly, if even lower time scale. So it's a cool data set. And I think Tarun was one of the speakers in the summer, and he kind of talked about this same data. And I'm kind of coming at it a little bit differently. And I'm basically looking at how well can I predict all of these solutes just given flow rate. So I have a model with 2 inputs, and I'm using Q and the log of the basically like a really smoothed and lagged version of Q is kind of what I was going for here. So the rolling average of Q from the past 10 days. And I'm outputting all the solute concentrations. So this is like the opposite of the component-wise model, because I have a few inputs and many outputs. And it's a small, I'm just for illustrative purposes, I have a small hidden size of 6, and my memory length is 9 hours. And this is basically the CQ plots. So the x-axis is normalized flow, and these are the concentrations. And these are all the different solute patterns. And you can see that, like, it's maybe not the most fabulous model, but it captures some main characteristics of the different solute behaviors. So, like, the key thing about potassium, for example, is that it mobilizes during this massive flow event that happened in October of 2021. All the other solutes tend to dilute. Nitrate is really crazy because it's an agricultural input, and sometimes it dilutes and sometimes it mobilizes, and that's like seasonally dependent. And you can kind of see like the model is like trying to, it's kind of like getting the wonkiness of nitrate and the power law behavior of some other solutes. So like, this is the model. The time series is really dominated by one really extreme flow event. And keep in mind that like most of the time points are actually here in like the much lower flow conditions. And yeah, like the model gets a lot better, especially for nitrate, if you increase the complexity of the model. But for now, I'm just kind of keeping it simple. Because basically I kind of wanted to look at things about the idea of temporal regimes of stream chemistry variables and interconnections between these different solutes. And instead of looking at the input layer weights, what I got into was looking at the output layer weights, because here, like, I only have two inputs. So I'm just kind of saying, like, okay, these two inputs are the things with which I want to predict solute concentrations, and both of them are actually flow rate. And so I kind of did some explorations, like basically like looking at the output layer weights by solute. And this is why I only have 6 hidden units, because I only wanted to look at 6 things. And this is kind of interesting. I had never really looked at this before, but it really kind of shows like things that I expect in terms of how solutes are related to each other. So for example, calcium and magnesium are very similar to each other. They're both geogenic solutes. They're often highly correlated in terms of the time series, and you can really see that reflected in the output weights. You might notice like so each of these colors is a different solute, and 2 of these things are not like the other. So for example, potassium and nitrates are just, they're very different. The weights are very different from the kind of like the general pattern that the other solutes are following. And these are both agriculturally influenced solutes. And like I said, potassium tends to mobilize, and that you can really see is like the weights are inverted. So yeah, the purple is potassium. So if the weights go up, the potassium basically goes down. So it's almost like a mirror image. And then nitrate does its own thing, and it basically, and then that's kind of like illustrated here where, this particular hidden unit has a much different weight for nitrate, and a similar one for everything else. And just another way to kind of like illustrate this, I was just trying to understand like how the effective output weights and the hidden unit dynamics were kind of like meshing together to give you a certain solute prediction. I generated totally fake hidden state time series patterns. So these are just completely made up data, like as if this is what you had gotten at the end of your LSTM for your hidden states. And kind of with the idea that like, okay, different hidden units are capturing like different types of patterns in the data. And some of those might be cyclical or increasing or decreasing or really highly variable. So this is totally fake data. And then if I apply the output weights that I showed in the previous slide to these hidden states and output fake solutes, these are fake time series of solute concentrations, and they kind of reflect what I wanted to see, which is like, okay, calcium and magnesium are highly correlated, but not quite the same. So they have, a certain difference. And potassium is this blue one, and it's kind of inverted. And then here, nitrates is this brown line, and it's just totally like doing something completely different than all the other solutes. And that basically is because of the output weights on these different hidden dynamics, such that the model is like pulling certain things out of the hidden states. And yeah, just an illustration of how the model is kind of capturing these solute interdependencies. Another way that I looked at it was kind of looking at like which hidden unit contributes most to each prediction. Because here I was kind of interested in getting like temporally varying influences on these different solutes and times at which their behavior is changing, sort of, or like times at which the interdependency between these are changing. And this kind of gets at it. So basically here the colors are the dominant hidden units. And then the gray, so this kind of light gray background that you probably can't see very well is that's the actual data for each of these solutes, and this is a time series. And then the colors are the predicted values, and the colored line is the predicted, and the actual color are the groupings of like the yellow hidden unit was the most highly weighted hidden unit for that prediction, and then the purple means like we had a shift, right? So kind of like different solutes are responsive to different patterns in the flow rate at different times, at least is what I want to say. And you can kind of see, like, for example, this is a really big flow event. So here we have big mobilization and big dilution. And, most solutes kind of pick this flow event out as like a special behavior. And you could kind of interpret like, this green here to be like, this is like the event response sort of time period, and then you switch into like another sort of behavioral regime. A thing that I haven't really looked at, but I think that you could kind of consider is these clusters of different time series points as in terms of like predictive accuracy. So, sometimes the information is there to predict concentration from flow. So sometimes concentrations are very predictable and sometimes they're just not. So an example here is this is a drought period, and the solutes are still pretty highly variable, but if you look at the flow data, it is extremely low. So it's just kind of like flow is just less explanatory in general of the solutes. So that's kind of like what we're seeing in these sort of like flat lines here. And very last thing, just another way to kind of look at this. I reran the model and I made it way bigger. So I made 100, I changed the hidden size from 6 to 128, just so that I had like way more hidden units. And then I got those relative contributions for each hidden unit, and each time that exists at each time point, and then I'm taking the entropy of those relative contributions. And this looks a little bit crazy because I'm just overlaying all the solutes on top of each other. But a high value, you can interpret a higher value of entropy to indicate that the hidden states are similarly influential. So there are a lot of hidden states that are having a consequential effect on the output. And then a lower entropy basically would mean that just a few hidden states are kind of dominating. So the model is like simplified. Because sometimes you need a lot of stuff to predict something, and sometimes you only need a little bit of stuff. So this is a example where we only need a little bit of stuff. And this, you can kind of see all of the time series, but especially potassium really plummets during this event right here. And that I'm kind of reading as the solute concentrations become very synchronized with flow during this particular event. So we have like a really sharp mobilization or dilution, and that is kind of being reflected in the way that the model is applying these like hidden states to the prediction. And yes, that is it. And I am happy to like go into the GitHub, but I think like the link is also just in the paper, and it was very easy to like open the Jupyter notebooks. But we can do that if you're interested, and otherwise I'm happy to take any questions or comments or discussion. Thanks.
So Allison, your goal is to try to get more insight into predictability of these solutes. What are you ultimately trying to understand here?
I did some previous work where I was looking at the predictability of these solutes during these different temporal regimes. So basically looking at times at which the interdependencies between solutes are changing. For example, sometimes calcium and nitrate are very correlated and they're positively correlated, and then suddenly they'll switch to being negatively correlated. And I used PCA and like identified those different regimes. Um, and then I was looking like within those regimes, what are the drivers of these solutes? So what are the variables that are predictive of them? And that changes between these time periods, and that's kind of that's like reflecting the fact that the interdependencies are changing, is like the things that are driving them are changing. But I didn't actually get to the point of predicting them. It was just kind of like an information theory look at, what is the potential predictability of these solutes given these variables, including flow rate, but not actually kind of like testing that with, like how well are we predicting during these different time intervals. So that's kind of where I started, and I'm not sure exactly where this is going, but
But can you give us some physical intuition here? Um, we're assuming that none of these solutes is present in the source water, and that they're all bound up or somehow in the soil or some source, and then as the flow changes, it can both mobilize the solute and either continue to mobilize more and more solute, or it only mobilizes a little bit of solute and then it's subject to uh, 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 what's the word you used? The concentration going down, dilution. Sorry,
dilution.
right. Can you explain the underlying model underlying this idea of mobilization and dilution? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of I'm bypassing the fact that no, I'm not assuming that like rainwater has nothing in it, and then like all these solutes are just entirely derived from the landscape. Because there's that, so there's, the the rainfall versus the groundwater have different concentration of these things, and they're all being, combined at the outlet, and this is a relatively large watershed. So this is the upper Sangamon River Basin, so it's like a good chunk of Illinois, is the size of this watershed. I'm also not considering like the reactions that are occurring. Like, nitrate is, it if you were to model this, you would be using like a reactive transport type of model for a lot of these things. Another one that I thought about would be kind of like a SWOT model, would be, I don't, well, maybe for the like nitrates and potassium, this would be more relevant for than some of the other ones. So right, so some of the each solute has a different profile in the soil, and that's highly heterogeneous, whether it's like, 90% of this catchment is agricultural. So maybe it's not as variable as you might think. But I'm kind of bypassing that and just assuming that the only information that I'm recording is flow, and what is the extent to which just knowing the flow rate and the history of the flow rate. So I didn't really get into like lag times here at all, but knowing the recent history of the flow and the flow are um, enabling you to model these. Um, because that's
And
kind of
just
like a lower bar, I guess, than if you had known everything about the catchment and you were able to truly kind of model based on like knowing what the subsurface concentrations and the rainwater content and things like that were.
just one final comment. When you showed your flow versus concentration curves a few slides back, um,
Know what's going on here. Okay.
no,
Yeah.
yeah, that one. I got the impression that there might be some hysteretic behavior in here.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if it would help to also include as a driver or causal factor, the rate of change of flow, in addition to the flow, and not require the LSTM to try to figure that out, but actually provide it explicitly.
Yeah, I think I tried that. And I found that what really helped was just more hidden units. Um,
Mm.
like this is just, I mean, like this looks way better. Like all of the hysteresis is captured if you included, like if I made this 12 or 18 or something. I kind of forgot like what the bound was where I started really like getting hysteresis. Because you can kind of see like it's almost picking it up. Um, it's trying to pick some of it up here. And
Right.
it's just like this event is really large and there's only one of them. And so in some ways it kind of biases the like biases what this CQ plot looks like. Because without it, it's just a much smaller range of flow variability.
It's
And those are
just that
holdout. Sorry, these are
it's
held
just
out
that
data, right?
sorry. Just to finish my comment, it's just that burying the thing in the LSTM is not nearly as satisfying as putting it in as an input, where you can, because then you can't explain it once it's buried. So
Yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead, Joe. Sorry.
I was just asking that these are held out data
Oh, Tim.
on the.
No, there's no
Okay.
no. No, this is like a maximally simple experiment where I wanted to make the inputs as few as because I guess my thought on the flow gradient was that if the model were good enough, it should be able to pick up on that information mostly from the history of the flow itself. And I found that flow gradient didn't have any like really large impact. But maybe that would enable you to still have like a small, like a lower model complexity and just more variations on Q in your input and get different things. But I think with the hysteresis question, I didn't show any of these plots on this, but like with the idea of like just different hidden dynamics, I was finding that certain hidden units would kind of be the hysteresis hidden units. And like they would be the ones where you would actually like see the circle, like you'd see the circular pattern. And so you can kind of trace back to be like, okay, like that's why the model is picking up hysteresis is because that hidden layer is what's or that hidden unit is like what's picking it up. Um, but if you have like hundreds of them, it's less easy to discern like what physical property is being picked up by each one.
Just one comment about flow gradients is that they're going to be very noisy uh, because you're doing differences. So if you did use them, you would have to do some kind of smoothing, um, because you might add information, but then cancel it out just because
Yeah,
just
which is what I
so
could
it's
have been doing.
noisy.
Like that could have been
Yeah.
why it didn't really make, it didn't improve my model. So yes, that could definitely be true. Um, so anyway, like the Granger causality, they really like focused on the input layers, and then I was like, oh well, here I am like looking at all the like taking the input layers and everything and just going straight to the output layers because I was looking at the interdependencies and I was just kind of realizing that the output layers were really what, explains how the solutes are interconnected. Um, but you could also go the other way and focus on, how do the inputs, like the weights on the inputs and how are those meaningful?
I'm going to risk stating what you already know, but if I was reading this paper, what I would love to see is, first to make some sort of narrative connection, like it's an agricultural watershed. You kind of you're still early in your work, but you said there's different regimes. I would like to see those regimes tied to, I don't know, agricultural practices, harvest, whatever.
Yeah.
But on top of that, if you can show that this is a nonlinear relationship, that it's not going to be well captured by a traditional bar approach, that would be really exciting. Just to confirm it. But I think And again, I'm a scientist. I need those narratives. You know, I need those narratives as the story of what's going on to
Yeah.
keep my interest.
That was kind of what my previous thing was trying to get to was the effect of intensive management and like the timing of fertilizer and planting and harvest on these dependencies changing. Because with nitrate, for example, you can really see it in like, a fall storm, it dilutes, and then in a spring storm, it mobilizes, and the relationship between it and other solutes changes. And if your model is too simple, you're never going to capture that. So like if you were just using a power law relationship or something like that to estimate nitrate, you're entirely unable to see those sorts of like seasonal changes. um but yes, thanks for the comment.
But thanks for the talk. Yeah, enjoyed it. Can I ask one more quick question about the paper though? I didn't get through it. Did they ever directly compare their deep learning approaches against a VAR? I saw they used like a VAR as their toy data set and checked how well, the MLP could capture it. But did they ever do the head-to-head?
You mean
And
like the predictive accuracy?
yeah,
No, I don't think. I think that's what
it's
I
kind of a
forget what
boring.
question was asking. Like I don't think they um yes, I don't think they like use that as one of their causality detection methods to compare with. Yes.
I kind of, I mean, I agree with the premise, right? If you have enough data, the MLP should do better. But I'm still interested in that regime where you don't know if you have enough data. But yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, and yeah, like the data sizes were not not very large. So I think that's what they were. They were kind of like, we don't have enough data to use a model-free method. So something like, they're kind of assuming like something like transfer entropy or a non-parametric method is just totally out, and we have to use a model. And what's the strongest model?
Hi, Alison.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it. Mostly because this is a paper that actually I have been following for quite some time as well. Um, and just in case you are all interested, there is actually about two or three papers that built on this paper to develop more complex methods. I think the most recent one is called something like Jacobian regularizer-based neural Granger causality. But they do resolve quite a number of the problems that we've raised here with that neural Granger causality. So you could check that out. We actually apply that. One of my PhD students applied that to drought detection and some sort of a water supply and demand relationship in grasslands in China. So I think that might also be worth checking out as well if you still want to push with the method. Because one of the struggles that we had, contrary to their assertion that if you don't have enough data, this is quite good, we kind of had a bit of struggle with that. And I'm not sure how much data is enough. Probably, but we had a bit of struggle with it, and that was what limited our use of the Tank et al. Version. And but then later on, I guess with the one that I just mentioned, quite a number of problems were resolved, including the sparsity constraints on the network weights. So if you're interested, you could also check that out as well.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, maybe you could put like the link in the chat or something. I don't know. It might be a way to. I think we used to have like a Google Doc or
Cool.
something group, but I think
Yeah, I was thinking of updating the Google document with the link, but I'll also paste it here as well.
yeah, you'd have to update it and then tell us all where it is because I don't know.
Alison, in the LSTM, as I understand it, in the generic LSTM, maybe Jonathan knows more about this. There's no inbuilt mechanism to make the hidden states relatively independent in some sense. The reason I'm asking this is arguably we should think of the hidden states as features. So you're learning 6 features because you've got 6 hidden states. And then you're asking, so these are features you're learning from the data, they're time varying features. And then you're asking how predictable is the thing that you care about based on those 6 features that you've learned from the data. And you gave this nice example where you created 6 features which had independent properties, which was kind of a cool way of illustrating that. But as far as I know, it's not typical to do something like they do in variational autoencoders, where they try to make sure that each dimension of the latent space is relatively independent, so you could tune each one independently. You know, it doesn't have to. I mean, you could think of principal component analysis, but in this case, they may be a nonlinear manifold of some kind. Anyway, I'm just curious if you've thought about looking into that as a way of trying to enhance interpretability, because as long as those 6 features are highly correlated, it's not clear what the weights actually are going to tell you, right?
Yeah, that's a really I finagled with a lot of things and messed with a lot of kind of ways to try to do that, or basically to try the way that I was coming at it was like I want different hidden units to learn different things, and I want them to
Sure.
be like really separable. Like I wanted like, oh, a hysteresis one and a long-term one and a short-term one, and I was just messing with all kinds of things, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone has the real answer to that. Because I definitely didn't get very far.
I think Yang, you worked on some idea where you tried to push different dimensions of the hidden space as far apart as possible. You had some kind of technique, if I recall.
Yeah, sorry, I just joined the conference. I have little idea what about the topic. Yeah, yeah. So I have done some research on latent space. Yeah, we use basically hyperparameter tuning, similar to conventional method for training machine learning models. Like we can identify the optimal number of latent space. For most case, I think increase the dimension of latent space have marginal improvement if you reach certain point. Like for modeling daily time step for catchments, I think you need around 10, which is like sufficient. But if you increase,
But more specifically, didn't you do some work where you pushed the different catchments as far apart as possible or something? You had some kind of metric which you were using as a regularization metric, and we're wondering if something like that could be used to try to force the hidden states to learn independent things somehow.
yeah. So we use for training, like for classifying catchments or hydrographs in latent space. So we try to have catchments similar to each other, closer in the latent space, that are dissimilar or far apart, push apart. So we use a loss function to train that. That loss is called info ICE. Basically it's a loss function used in information theory to optimize the noise to signal ratio, like to reduce. So basically, it is the loss called info ICE. It has multiple versions. Basically, you have some positive sample and negative sample. You want the positive sample to be as close as possible in the latent space, and the negative samples are as far as possible in the latent space. Yeah, I'm not sure if I just I answered the question because I just joined the meeting like 1 minute ago. I'm sorry.
No, the comment really was I was saying that when you train an LSTM, the hidden states are entangled in principle, in general.
Yes. Yeah.
And is there a way to disentangle? Is there a way to train the LSTM in such a way that the hidden states are as disentangled as possible? And if something like this info ICE could be used, I know they do this in variational autoencoders where they try to make the latent space to be independent so that you can tune different knobs,
Yeah.
to make the image turn left and right and change the color and so on and so forth. So anyway, I was just wondering if anybody knew anything about something that could be used to regularize an LSTM. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for optimizing the latent space, one way is just to increase the sparsity, like overall distribution of the points, such that this is like can be considered as like normal distribution, because points are like far away on average with each other point. So you can just use very like some people just use very simple, very basic optimization method. One method is called adversarial autoencoder. So basically, they want the latent space to be as close as possible to a Gaussian distribution, and they just have a target function. So they map how linearity it is. Like we have a discriminator who can tell from the real normal distribution samples with the latent space samples. Then you train similar to like a GAN network, generative adversarial network, to train on the latent space. So you build a GAN on a latent space. So that's a very simple way to do it. In that way, because it's a like Gaussian distribution, standard Gaussian distribution. So every dimension is relatively independent. Then you can adjust each dimension to see what happened.
Sure. The only other thing that jumps into my mind, Allison, would be that if you calculated the correlation matrix on the state space, it'll be a time-varying correlation matrix, of course, and then you penalize it for being different from diagonal or something like that.
I did in one experiment. I didn't work.
Didn't work? Okay.
No.
Yes, don't do that. Don't do that.
I mean, there has to
Yeah,
be
but
something out there because I know that they use this in generative modeling in order to make the generative models interpretable, right? So there has to be something out there.
yeah, sure. My guess is that this could work if you have just a few latent space or latent variables, because in the moment that you have 10 or 20, you can impose kind of a independency, but it's impossible. At the end, you have so many possible combinations that basically it's the same. But if you have 2 or 3, yes, probably you can separate them. But the other thing that I was thinking in my case with the hydro LCM, that one option could be that different cells can have different memories. So in this way, at the end, you can create this kind of separation. This is kind of a fast flow. This is a kind of base flow, and create. You can separate this kind of cells if you are imposing different memories. That in some ways related with what we were watching now. That this idea of the lag that each process needs.
So if you had some way of measuring the average memory thing, and then you put a regularizing constraint to push them apart. The other thing I was thinking of was if you were to do clustering on the states, where you try to force similar states to cluster together and different states to cluster apart. That's why I thought of your approach, Yang Yang. I thought there must be some way to adapt it. Yeah.
Yeah, in some ways, what I did with the regional LSTM, hydro LSTM, when
Exactly.
I posted this kind of a clustering before, so the cluster is defining what are the weights. So in some way, it's trying to push kind of the model to different region. This is one region, this is another region, and this way you can separate them.
There must be a simple way to but there must be a very simple way to do it where you can just add it as part of the cost function, right? Yeah,
Probably, yeah.
interesting challenge. Hmm.
Well, it's a good topic for a PhD student.
Yep. I mean, you could think of this in relationship to hyperparameter tuning, right? Because if you start with small numbers of hidden states and you keep increasing them, presumably you only want to add a new hidden state if it adds value. And you can think of adding value both in terms of improving predictive power, but also in terms of adding a new dimension to the new independent dimension to the state space.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was trying to get to with that entropy thing, where
Mm-hmm.
just the fact that you might have a whole lot of hidden states and only a few of them are the things that are driving the output.
Mm-hmm.
But it's time dependent, so you might have other times where you best be glad that you had all those hidden states because you used all of them to make your prediction.
When I was talking with Ralph Loritz in Germany, he had done some early experiments where he found that different states of the LSTM were canceling each other out. In other words, his suspicion was that there were too many hidden states over there, and that made it even more difficult to interpret because one state would do something and the other one would go, no, that's not helping, so I'm going to cancel you out. So you kind of want to reduce it to. There's a term in the literature I've been looking at called intrinsic dimensionality, right? Which is this idea that there is some intrinsic dimension to the latent space, and as we're trying to discover our representations, part of our challenge is figuring out what is that intrinsic dimension, and then in that intrinsic dimension, what does the manifold look like? Hmm.
Yeah. Maybe, well, somebody could create a kind of a loss function or something that is measuring, because at the end we have to maximize the entropy in each one of the cells, but at the same time we have to minimize the mutual information with the
Of
other
Carson.
ones.
There's an idea.
The problem is how we are going to measure that.
Well, even if you have an approximate way of measuring it, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. Hmm.
Could you repeat that?
I was too fast. No, that you need to maximize the information itself, so the entropy of a cell, but at the same time you have to minimize the mutual information between these cells and the other ones.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe your can matrix approach, Luis.
Yes, he's doing something like that.
Luis has been working on something which he will talk to us about, hopefully soon.
Yeah, in the AU, I have a presentation of that.
Okay, okay. Well, if you want to practice before AGU, I don't know what Leela's got on the agenda.
Yeah, we actually have an open space for December 3rd. So if you want to go ahead and yeah, you can take that spot.
Oh, ouch. Let me think. I have to prepare
Yeah,
the
yeah.
presentation first.
Yeah, no pressure at all. Just an opportunity to practice.
So, but can I push back a little bit, Luis? You said you tried calculating the correlation matrix and then imposing some kind of penalty on that correlation matrix from being different from diagonal, right? I mean, basically, we just have to calculate. What do we have to calculate? We want all the off-diagonal terms to go to zero, essentially, right?
Mm, okay.
So if you squared all if you took the absolute values of all the off-diagonal terms and then summed them up and used that as an L1 norm in principle, and then if you assume that the output layer latent space, the hidden variables are supposed to be linearly independent, so that you combine them using you know, all the features are supposed to be linearly independent features, so you can superpose them. Then in principle, something like that should both drive the features to be linearly superposable and independent. So I'm
Yes,
trying to
but
understand why it didn't work and what might be the reason. Yeah.
this work, but the problem is that this doesn't mean that they are interpretable, because basically you are creating a space that could be orthogonal. But after
Mhm.
that, yes, could be orthogonal. But anyway, you can rotate exactly the same in many positions, and that there are infinite ways to combine them, and they are still orthogonal. So
Sure.
they could be independent, but they are not interpretable.
Well, at least be a first step.
Sure, sure, sure.
Then you would have to figure out how to interpret it. But I don't know. Maybe that would help, Allison. You could try to put some regularize, just calculate the correlation matrix of uh, the uh, the average correlation matrix through time and try to drive it. And then, because in your case, you only have six or so um, uh, latent features, but maybe when you took those and then you plotted that time variation, it might reveal something about what they mean or how they could be interpreted. With six, it might not be too difficult.
6 hidden units, you mean, or 6
Yeah.
things that I'm predicting? Okay.
No, so the idea is you would take the time varying hidden states of your six LSTM cells, and you would calculate at every time step you would calculate across time steps the correlation matrix of those six.
Across all the time steps,
Yeah,
like
you
you have.
calculate the covariance matrix and you normalize it to get you
Yeah.
normalize it to get the
Yeah.
correlation matrix. And then you would take the off-diagonal terms of that, which are the ones that are not one, and you would put them into an L1 norm or something like that. And then you would add that as a regularizing constraint on the cost function when you're training.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
That was a very interesting talk. Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
This is kind of like, because we're talking about, I like especially the fact that, you're doing some sort of um, quick and dirty analysis. And it's that kind of stuff which is very helpful to promote discussion. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's quick and dirty, but it was also just me learning about LSTMs in the first place because I just did not have the
Sure.
background and I just started getting into it this summer and yeah, that's where I got.
Sure. I'm just looking at the comments. Joe said something about information bottleneck. Yeah. All right, Lila, what's up next?
So we have, yeah, as I mentioned before, we have an open space for December 3rd, and that will be our last meeting of the year. So yeah, if any of you want to take, that's that's just an opportunity to practice your AU presentation, or if you want to continue with this topic or any other topic that you find interesting.
All right, sounds
Yeah.
good. So we'll try to find somebody to lead at least a discussion on December, and
Yes.
I'm sure we can find something. Yeah.
Yeah. Or Hoshin, if you want to take the spot, that's also an
Let me
option.
take a look and see what's happening on that day, and certainly we can at least have a discussion on something. Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right.
Awesome.
Nice to see you guys.
Okay.
Thanks
See you
again,
later.
Watson.
Thanks,
was-
Alison. Great talk. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.